I will say again, this is not theory to me. I don't just talk the talk on these issues. I'm the only candidate who's actually walked the walk by making big scale changes to reorient systems away from shelter and toward housing. That's what I did when I ran housing in this city and created dramatically more supportive housing. And it's what I did when I led the strategy for President Obama that reduced family homelessness by 25% across this country. We reoriented our shelter systems toward housing by making sure that we were investing in our housing agencies and in every other piece that's needed. I went to Albany and I created a landmark New York 3 agreement that made sure we didn't just have the money to build the housing, but we had money year after year to pay for the services in that housing and fundamentally reoriented the system. And guess what we found out? The supportive housing that we built had dramatic impacts on families' lives. And you know this, you said it yourself, Kaden. It would have been so much better for you, your child, to be in an apartment rather than a shelter. So much easier to do work, have more space to be able to cook yourself, all of those things. But you know what else? We learned that it's actually less expensive as well. And why is that? Because we're spending $3 billion a year. It's that $4,000 a month that you talked about, $3 billion a year in total on hotels and shelters. And guess what? We're also spending far too much imprisoning our kids, treating your health issues in the emergency room rather than making sure that you can get the preventive health care, the maternal health care, all of those things that you need. And when you're in a shelter, you're not getting that help. If you're in supportive housing with the services on site, you will get the preventive care, the prenatal care, all of that you need, the mental health care. Because Lord knows, being homeless is incredibly hard on you, on your kid, and incredibly hard, especially in a year of COVID. And so we need to reorient this system. I'm the only one who's actually done that in my career.
You know, you almost say to yourself that, listen, this is not only about dollars and cents, this is about common sense. You know, $4,000 a month for a place that's not really suitable. You could go to Waldorf Astoria for that dollar amount. People are eating off of the dysfunctionality of the system. That is where the problem is. So many people benefit from this dysfunctional shelter system. And so as I announced yesterday with Robbie Carnegie, the housing chair, what I said to HRA and HPD, I said, why do we have so many units that are vacant where we can place people into housing in those units, and it will actually be cheaper? When we spend 70% of our budget on shelters, that makes no sense at all. My focus is going to be a focus on housing, getting people out of shelters, cycling them into permanent housing. And we can do it on several different levels. Number one, let's look at those available units that we have. Then let's look at those units where it's 130% of AMI, but they're not being filled. No one is taking them because people just go into other locations and they are renting the market rates. So if government subsidize a family that is not meeting that 130% AMI, you're actually saving money instead of leaving the apartment vacant. And then again, let's be creative about basement apartments. Let's be creative about hotel spaces. Let's be creative about putting people on a pathway to low income co-ops and Mitchell-Lammers and programs like that. So we need to be creative and take the money out of a shelter system and put it in a housing system.
So as you state in your question, that's just stupid on the part of government to spend $4,000 a month for something that is in a home where, goodness gracious, we could go get a luxury apartment with some nice granite countertops or something. And so this is where we make penny wise, pound foolish decisions. What if we made it so that the voucher was closer to 2,000 even, which is a huge increase on the voucher? You're still saving 50%. And you're still creating a permanent home. And that is housing that heals. So I do not have a shelter first approach. I have a housing first approach. And to make decisions that are actually much wiser moving forward, because that is pretty dumb. It's like to spend all that money and you don't get anything for it.
My plan, in my economic comeback plan, in my infrastructure plan in specific, and part of that is building deeply affordable housing, which I would commit to. And I would commit to, just to give you a sense of what I mean, we could commit $1 billion, which we can afford, and I know how to fund it, and create 5,300 plus units of deeply affordable housing. And that deeply affordable housing, like what we see in the Bronx community that I've identified, that I've referenced, that rents go from the base $215 a month to a 3-bedroom for $1,995 a month. The $4,000 that you've just described is ludicrous. That's ludicrous. Just think about how much we're paying, that $4,000 a month, which we could be used, which we could invest in building deeply affordable houses. So people have their dignity. And it may have been a nice place, but for $4,000 a month, that's like totally crazy. And we can't have that. I wouldn't have that. I'd restructure the whole thing, which is what we're going to have to do, which is why I'm going to have part of my Go Big plan, create 500,000 jobs, get people to work in building our home, the homes that are necessary. We can no longer afford to do this. And furthermore, it's not right to do it this way. There's a much better way, which I've outlined. So deeply affordable housing, $1 billion, 5,300 units, lots of jobs, and $2 to $2.5 billion of economic activity.
So, one of the things I mentioned already is the need to move away. So we spend about $3 billion a year on our shelters. So we can't turn it on and off like a switch, right? But we can make a gradual transition of divesting from those shelter systems, because the shelter operators have kind of become like their own industry. We have to move away from that gradually and move towards the permanent housing, expanding permanent housing. And the way there's a couple different ways I think we need to do that. The city could purchase existing vacant apartments, hotels, commercial spaces, office spaces, buildings that are facing foreclosure, and we can turn those things into housing. And we could prioritize turning them into permanent, affordable housing for families, for homeless families and individuals. I've also talked publicly about exercising what's called eminent domain, right? Which is the right that the city has to just say, we're taking this property or we're taking this land because we need it for an urgent city need, right? That goes back to my quote, when I quoted Ronald Reagan, it's like, it's a choice that our leaders can make to say, we're not gonna tolerate homelessness in this city anymore. We are gonna prioritize our people and make sure that everybody has access to housing. So that's another eminent domain is another tool that we can use. And then one of the other last things I'll say is public land. The city has access to public land and sometimes will take that land and sell it to private for-profit developers. I would make a commitment to use 100% of our public land to build affordable housing and not sell it for profit, because those profit making developers then build luxury housing that's not affordable to the average New Yorker anyway. We could make a commitment, again, this is about leadership. We can make a commitment to prioritize accessing the public land that exists only to provide affordable housing for New Yorkers.
I think I mentioned this earlier. The city has this backwards. They spend more time negotiating with slumlords to pay them $4,000 a month to house a woman and child, in your case, in a homeless shelter, than they do to build affordable housing. And I think we need a real housing plan that aligns shelter services or homeless services and an affordable housing plan. And here's what I'm going to do as mayor. I'm going to access the thousands of vacant property in this city. property that the city owns, taxpayer owned, we own it, right? Rather than give it to shelter operators and luxury developers, I'm going to give that land back to the people as mayor. I'm going to work with community-based organizations and not-for-profits to build the low-income housing we need. I'm going to redirect the 421A subsidy, which is basically a luxury subsidy that's developer-centric, and rather create a subsidy that actually lowers the AMI and builds the actual housing we need for people who make under $40,000 a year trying to feed a child and support a family. That is what we have to do. Rather than bragging about building 90 shelters, I want to build 90 buildings that reflect the rich diversity and the housing need of people in our 5 boroughs. And we have done this in the city before. We built public housing in the 30s. We built Mitchell-Ama housing in the 50s and 60s. We actually gave abandoned buildings back to community organizations in the 80s and 90s and created whole new communities. And we have not done that in the past 8 years. In fact, we have just built luxury housing and we sprinkled in unaffordable housing along the way. As mayor, my plan is specific, it's detailed, it's real, and I will implement it on day one.